There is a kind of quiet that doesn't come from the world, but from within. As we grow older, we begin to understand that being alone is not the same as being lonely. In fact, solitude can become one of the most healing companions in our later years. Carl Jung believed that the soul speaks not through noise, but through silence. It's when we're alone, truly alone, that we begin to hear the voice we've ignored for years, the voice of the self. This is not about isolation, it's about space to breathe, to reflect, to return. Here are 3 quiet ways being alone can begin to heal you, supported by Jung's timeless wisdom. Way 1. Solitude helps you hear your inner voice again. There comes a time in life when the world begins to quiet, not because it has changed, but because something within the individual has. The speed, the noise, the endless expectations that once filled every hour begin to lose their grip. What used to feel urgent now feels distant. The demands of careers, families, and responsibilities no longer call with the same volume. And in that space, often unfamiliar, sometimes uncomfortable, there appears something else. The possibility of solitude. Not loneliness, but chosen aloneness. And with it comes the faint return of something many have forgotten how to hear: the inner voice. For years, even decades, that voice may have been buried under the weight of doing, of becoming, of serving others, maintaining order, fulfilling roles. And for most people, that suppression is necessary. Survival demands it. The world rewards extroversion, certainty, achievement. And so, little by little, the quiet voice inside becomes faint. Not gone, not destroyed, just silent, waiting. Jung believed that this inner voice, the voice of the true self, can only be heard in silence. It speaks not in commands, but in symbols, images, intuitions. It speaks in the body, in dreams, in unexpected tears. It whispers rather than shouts. And in the noise of daily life, it is almost impossible to hear. But solitude changes that. Solitude removes the external soundtrack and brings a person into contact with their own rhythm. It is in solitude that the mind begins to unclench, the breath deepens, and the thoughts slow down enough to make room for something older, something wiser. At first, this silence can be intimidating. Many resist it. They turn on the television, check the phone, make lists, clean things that don't need cleaning, anything to avoid the stillness. But when one allows themselves to remain in it, not forcefully but gently, they begin to feel a shift. The quiet, instead of feeling empty, begins to feel spacious. And in that space, the inner voice returns. This voice is not concerned with status or reputation. It doesn't care about comparison or approval. It speaks of longings, of truth, of memory, of the person beneath the roles. For someone entering this reflective stage of life, the return of this voice can feel like meeting an old friend, someone they had forgotten, but who never stopped waiting for them. The voice may remind them of things they once loved, but abandoned. It may question routines that now feel hollow. It may offer unexpected peace or gentle discomfort, but always it speaks with honesty. Jung described this as the process of individuation, the path of becoming oneself, not in opposition to others, but in union with one's true nature. Individuation, he taught, is not the pursuit of ego, but the unfolding of the soul, and solitude is essential to that unfolding. Not isolation, not withdrawal from life, but the conscious act of creating space to listen inward. In earlier years, such solitude is often impractical, but later in life, it becomes not only possible, it becomes sacred. In solitude, a person begins to notice the subtle messages that have always been there, the way their body responds to certain places or people, the thoughts that emerge in stillness, the themes that repeat in dreams. These are the languages of the inner voice. They are often missed in busy lives, but in solitude they come into focus. Slowly, a new relationship with oneself begins to form. Not the outer self, the one shaped for others, but the inner self, who exists beyond roles, beyond performance. This self may feel unfamiliar at first. It may ask for things the ego finds inconvenient: rest, simplicity, truth. But the more one listens, the more aligned life begins to feel. The healing begins here, not in solving problems, but in reconnecting with that quiet center. Many people report, that after spending time alone, walking in nature, sitting in silence, writing without a goal, they feel more like themselves. Their thoughts feel clearer. Their emotions make more sense. They are less reactive and more grounded. This is not magic. It is simply the return of inner alignment, and it is available to anyone who is willing to be quiet long enough to hear what is already inside them. Solitude also helps differentiate between the inner voice and the many outer voices that have shaped a person's beliefs. Sometimes what we think is our truth is actually someone else's expectation. A parent's voice, a teacher's opinion, a cultural standard. In solitude, these borrowed voices fall away, and the authentic voice begins to stand on its own. It may feel smaller at first, but it is stronger, because it is real, and it is yours. This rediscovery can be profoundly emotional. Some find themselves weeping in solitude, not from sadness, but from relief. To be alone and not feel judged, to be quiet and not feel useless, to be still and yet feel deeply alive. These are experiences that modern life rarely encourages, but in later years, they become more available and more essential. Solitude doesn't require a retreat or a monastery. It can happen in a garden, a quiet room, a slow morning with no plan. What matters is the intention, to listen. Not to fix, not to plan, not to evaluate, just to listen. And in that listening, the soul breathes. Over time, solitude shifts from something we occasionally experience to something we begin to crave. Not because we want to escape others, but because we want to reconnect with ourselves. In solitude, the inner voice becomes less of a stranger and more of a guide. It teaches what truly nourishes us, what no longer serves, what longs to be remembered, what still wants to be lived. And as this voice becomes more familiar, it becomes easier to carry into the rest of life. Even when surrounded by others, a person who has cultivated solitude carries with them a sense of groundedness. They are not pulled so easily by distraction. They do not need to fill every silence. They are less afraid of their own company. And this is a kind of freedom that can only be found in solitude. Jung believed that the soul speaks in symbols, in silence, in mystery. He believed that healing comes not just from insight, but from integration, from allowing all parts of the self to be heard and held. Solitude is where that integration begins. It is where the conversation with the self is no longer postponed. And it is where, often for the first time in years, the inner voice is heard not as a whisper, but as a truth. Way 2. Solitude gives space for forgotten feelings and dreams to surface. In the quiet that follows the busyness of earlier life, there is often an unexpected unfolding. As responsibilities shift and time expands, a kind of psychological space begins to open. It is within this space, when the world stops demanding constant movement, that something long forgotten starts to stir. Forgotten feelings, dormant dreams, memories not just of events, but of desires once held and never pursued. In solitude, these parts begin to rise, not as intrusions, but as returning truths seeking acknowledgement. Carl Jung observed that what is repressed or unlived does not disappear. It waits in the unconscious, gathering weight, until the psyche is ready to bring it forward. Often that readiness does not come in the earlier decades of life. There is too much to do. Careers must be built, families raised, identities protected. The soul makes sacrifices to survive, and the deeper longings of the heart are often set aside for more urgent matters, not out of failure, but out of necessity. But later, when the external demands have softened and the inner landscape quiets, those longings begin to surface again. Solitude is the setting in which these forgotten pieces of the self begin to appear. It acts as a kind of inner clearing, a pause in the relentless story of doing where the person begins to feel rather than perform. And in that feeling, the body starts to remember. A deep sense of yearning may arise, not necessarily for things lost, but for the emotions and dreams that were never given space to grow. These can be tender moments. Sometimes, grief emerges, not only for loved ones who have passed, but for parts of the self that were never fully lived. The artist who was buried under obligation, the traveler who stayed home, the poet who stayed silent, the lover who never spoke. These are not regrets in the traditional sense. They are invitations. They ask not for rewinding life, but for acknowledging what still stirs inside. Solitude allows these invitations to arrive gently. There is no one to impress, no schedule to keep. In this stillness, a person might find themselves recalling the sound of their childhood home, or the way they used to feel when they danced alone in their bedroom. They may remember a love that never found words, a fascination with something that once made their heart race. They may begin to cry without understanding why, and realize the tears have been waiting for years. Jung believed that these returns are essential to the process of becoming whole. What is not integrated will always seek return. And when the conscious mind is no longer dominated by routine or noise, the unconscious steps forward. Dreams may become more vivid. Memories that haven't surfaced in decades may arrive without warning, and feelings that were once buried beneath the roles and rules of adulthood may come alive again, not to cause distress, but to be welcomed, witnessed, and finally allowed to breathe. This is not about living in the past. It is about letting the past speak. Often in solitude, people discover that what they thought was gone has only been sleeping. A deep love for music, a connection to nature, a desire to write, to paint, to learn a new language. Solitude gives permission to explore not as obligation, but as rediscovery, to approach life not as a set of tasks, but as a canvas still open to expression. For some, these forgotten dreams are small, simple acts that were once meaningful but slipped away in the rush of responsibility. The joy of journaling, the peace of gardening, the thrill of creating something with their hands. For others, the dreams are more symbolic, a way of living that once felt authentic, but was traded for something safer or more socially acceptable. In solitude, these inner voices return, and they do not accuse. They simply ask, "Is there still time for me?" The answer is rarely about grand reinvention. It is about intimacy with the self. Solitude becomes a sacred space to listen, to feel the full range of what has been waiting. Not every dream must be acted upon. Some are meant only to be remembered, honored, felt. But even that act of remembering is healing. It closes loops. It softens the inner landscape. It makes room for peace. Forgotten feelings also return in solitude, not just dreams. Emotions that were too painful, too complex, or too inconvenient in earlier life begin to rise. Sometimes, sadness comes without a clear reason. Sometimes anger that was swallowed decades ago finds its voice. And sometimes, unexpectedly, joy returns, pure, childlike, and unconditioned. These feelings are not symptoms to be managed. They are signals of life moving back through the body. They are signs that the soul is being heard. In this space, healing is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is the healing of integration, the process of saying yes to every part of who one has been. The forgotten feelings and dreams are not mistakes. They are part of the fabric of the self. And when they are finally welcomed, the person begins to feel more whole, less fragmented, less defined by what was done or not done, and more connected to the fullness of their own humanity. Jung taught that this process, allowing the unconscious to speak, integrating what was once repressed, is the essence of individuation. It is the journey towards becoming oneself in totality. And that journey often begins when one is finally alone enough to listen. Solitude is not just a break from others. It is a reunion with the self, a return to the inner life. And it is here, in the silence, that the most powerful reconnections happen. A soft conversation between the present and the past. A meeting between the adult and the child within. A recognition that nothing was ever truly lost, only waiting. For the person entering this stage of life, solitude becomes less about escape and more about return. It becomes a kind of homecoming. And in that homecoming, they discover that the most important parts of them have been there all along, just waiting for the quiet to be heard again. Way 3, solitude deepens your relationship with the unconscious. In the stillness that follows the busyness of earlier life, a subtle shift occurs. The noise of the world fades and something older, quieter, and often overlooked begins to rise to the surface. That something is the unconscious, the vast inner terrain that holds not only memories and dreams, but wisdom, mystery, and the full spectrum of what a person has lived, felt, feared, and longed for. Jung believed that the unconscious is not a dark pit to be feared, but a source of rich meaning and guidance. It is not the opposite of consciousness, but its complement, the other half of what it means to be whole. And it is solitude that opens the door to this deeper relationship. Throughout most of life, the unconscious remains largely unseen. This is not because it is absent, but because life's rhythms leave little room for reflection. The mind is pulled outward, toward work, relationships, schedules, expectations. There is always a task to complete, a message to answer, a role to perform. The external world takes center stage, and the inner world becomes like a quiet house at the end of a long road, still standing, still alive, but rarely visited. But solitude changes this. It quiets the pull of the outside and invites a turning inward. With time, patience, and attention, solitude creates a space in which the unconscious can speak again. It speaks not in language, but in symbols, in dreams, in subtle sensations, in images that appear during daydreams, in a feeling that lingers with no obvious cause. The unconscious does not argue. It suggests, it reveals, it nudges. And when one is alone, truly alone, without distraction or performance, these messages begin to take shape. Often they come first as discomfort, a vague unease, a restlessness that seems to have no name. But beneath that discomfort is something trying to emerge, something that the deeper self wants to say. Solitude allows the person to stay with that discomfort long enough to hear it. Jung understood that the unconscious is not just a repository of forgotten things, it is a guide. It holds the wisdom of the entire psyche. It knows what has been buried, what has been avoided, and what still seeks integration. In solitude, the person begins to dream more vividly. They notice recurring themes. A certain landscape appears again and again, a forgotten face, a strange animal. These are not random. They are the language of the unconscious, trying to bring forth what the conscious mind has yet to understand. And the more a person listens, the more coherent that language becomes. There is also a kind of emotional intelligence that resides in the unconscious. Emotions that were never fully processed, grief, rage, longing, tenderness, can begin to rise in solitude. They do not rise to overwhelm, but to be felt, honored, and finally released. Jung believed that what is not brought to consciousness remains in control of our lives and will appear as fate. In solitude, the person begins to see the outlines of these forces. They begin to ask, why have I always reacted this way? Why does this memory still carry weight? Why have I avoided this part of myself? These questions do not require immediate answers. Simply asking them begins the work of integration. Solitude creates the container for this inner work. It provides the safety and stillness required to face parts of the self that were once too painful or confusing. It allows the conscious and unconscious to meet, not as adversaries, but as partners. In this meeting, healing happens, not because a problem is solved, but because a relationship is restored. The person is no longer split between who they are and what they've hidden. They begin to feel whole again. This relationship with the unconscious does not require analysis or expertise. It requires presence, a willingness to feel what arises, a patience for silence, a respect for mystery. Many people find that simply sitting in nature, writing in a journal, or quietly observing their thoughts opens the door to this deeper connection. The unconscious is always speaking. Solitude is how we remember how to listen. For someone in the later stages of life, this process can feel especially meaningful. It offers a kind of spiritual deepening that is not based on dogma or doctrine, but on direct experience. The unconscious becomes less of a stranger and more of a sacred guide. It shows where love was withheld, where courage was born, where truth was hidden. And it offers dreams, not as entertainment, but as maps. Maps to the parts of the self that still seek expression. Jung called this the individuation process, the journey toward becoming whole by uniting the conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche. This journey is not linear. It is cyclical, layered, evolving, and it does not require action in the external world. Much of it happens in the quietest spaces, while walking, while sitting alone, while staring out a window, and simply letting the mind rest. In those moments, something begins to align. The inner world stops feeling like a burden and begins to feel like a home, a place of richness, of symbols, of memory and meaning, a place that was never far, only forgotten. The longer one stays in solitude, the clearer the conversation becomes. It is not always easy. The unconscious holds not only beauty, but shadow. But it is in meeting the shadow that one becomes free. Not perfect, but real. Not immune to pain, but capable of holding it without collapse. In solitude, a person learns that the unconscious is not dangerous, it is sacred. And the peace that comes from that relationship is unlike any other. By the time one reaches the later years of life, there is a gift waiting in the quiet. A deeper self, ready to be met. Not the self shaped by roles or reputation, but the self that has watched and waited through every season. Solitude opens the gate to that self. And when one walks through it, they do not find emptiness. They find depth, mystery, healing, and a profound sense of having come home.